There we go. Yes, I was muted there for a moment, but I'm back. Okay. Hey friends. Here we are. Another fine day. We'll get started officially in just a minute. So let me just say, if you have any questions, this would be a good time for you to throw them at me. Because what else have I got to do? I have a bunch of things I want to talk about. It might get a little messy, especially if I start getting lots of questions, but questions are good. I am all in favor of those. Now, this is a Zoom session, and I have opened it up to my Patreon followers, and unfortunately, none of them have joined in. They never do. I think they're shy. This is what I experience in my classes too. That yeah, we're all on Zoom. You can all chime in. You can flip your camera on. You can talk to me. And it's all good, and everyone just sits there mute because I'm about to overwhelm them with knowledge, I guess. Okay, it is officially 11 o'clock. So let me switch a few things around here. Stop sharing that. Let's get my face up there on the screen. Not that it's a particularly attractive face. Okay, so as I said, the way this works is I'm going to talk to you for a bit, but feel free to interrupt, feel free to ask questions. I got my chat window open right here. I can see what you're talking about, and we're going to have a little discussion about some things. So what prompted this is that there's been a little bit of an argument going on over at Larry Moran's blog, Sandwalk, which I highly recommend. There's a lot of good stuff at Sandwalk, a lot of nitty-gritty details. He doesn't get distracted by either spiders or the various arguments going about on the internet, on social sites and things like that. He's just talking straight up science over there. So yeah, if you want it undistilled, go visit the Sandwalk, and I'll include a link down below, so it'll be easy for you to do that, I hope. Anyway, so what brought this on? Well, there's been a little argument brewing on the Sandwalk. I think partly it was prompted by the death of Lewontin. So a lot of people are thinking about things about Lewontin and his good buddy, Stephen J. Gould. So let me flip this over and share the Sandwalk with you. Okay. So this is the question that was asked there is the modern synthesis effectively dead? What an interesting question, and one that creationists would love to miscomprehend and talk about. So anyway, what it's talking about though is this idea of this thing called the modern synthesis or the neo-Darwinian synthesis. And what Larry wants to argue is that, yeah, the synthesis as formulated in the 50s and 60s is effectively dead, that it's just not viable anymore. And so the focus, the primary reason for thinking that way is, as he says, by the early 1960s, the most popular version of the modern synthesis focused almost exclusively on natural selection, an emphasis that's referred to as the hardening of the synthesis. It was this excessively adaptationist view of evolution that led to Gould and Lewontin's paper on the spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian paradigm, a critique of the adaptationist program. Okay, so this I think is a valid point. that there was a hardening of the synthesis, that a lot of people were focused on natural selection as in the extreme case, the sole and most interesting facet of evolutionary theory. I have personally heard Richard Dawkins say exactly that yeah, there's these other phenomena going, but they're not interesting. The only interesting stuff is natural selection. And there's a bit of a truth to this, in that natural selection is powerful, it's real. A lot of the work in the 50s and 60s, yes, thumbs up, it was a really good analysis. There's no disagreement on my part with the importance of natural selection. There's a whole bunch of stuff that requires natural selection. Okay, it's a critical component of evolutionary theory. What Gould was writing about, though, was that maybe there's too much emphasis on selection to the exclusion of all the other phenomena that were starting to be observed and discussed and studied in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and so forth. So yeah, that as he says here, Gould came out guns blazing and talking about an over-reliance on adaptationist thinking. Oh, I see we got a question there. What else is there besides natural selection? Magic? No, there's drift. For one thing, there's all kinds of phenomena that go on that lead to the increase of variation in a population. Now, people disagree with that. They disagree with Gould's perspective on this, and that's fine. There's good things to talk about. It's a good thing to discuss and to study further. Then he leads into some of the evidence. I will not discuss this in great detail here. Go read Larry's blog, and yeah, there's interesting stuff here. So yeah, Gould is known for a number of things. One is emphasis of the role of chance. So he talks a lot about chance variation. He also talks about a hierarchical perspective. In particular, if you read The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, his big final book before his death, a lot of that is about different levels of selection, different levels of evolution, for that matter. It's really interesting stuff, but it is hard to get into, in part because Gould's book is terrible. It's just badly written, and it's a book that desperately needed an editor. So I'll defer discussing this, but there's interesting material there. And then he makes a critique of adaptation. That's another thing that's really important. That there are non-adaptive features of organisms that constrain or enable. There's a lot of discussion nowadays in the developmental biology community in particular. Is constraint really a good word to use? Because some of these inherited variations promote evolution in particular directions. And so they're not just a straitjacket on evolution. They also permit and encourage variation in particular directions. Okay, so Jerry Coyne posted something about punctuated equilibrium is dead. And that's where it gets a little weird. And I'll mention also that on my blog, John Harshman came along. He also showed up on the Sandwalk to talk about this. John apparently doesn't like punctuated equilibrium at all. And so he wants to argue that, yeah, this is a major problem, that it's really, really dead. Aha, I see somebody has joined us. Hello, Jason. Anyway, so I'll continue on. If Jason wants to jump in, that's just fine. Yeah, so the question is punctuated equilibrium dead or not? And I would say that no, with reservations, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And also he makes this point here that I think this is a really good point, is that Gould did not kill the modern synthesis. That was King and Jukes and Kimura and Ota and a bunch of other people, proponents of things like neutral theory. They basically killed the previous conception of the modern synthesis. So that happened. In this case, I would argue the things that are mentioned up here are big issues for Stephen J. Gould. But neutral theory, punctuated, and well, punctuated equilibrium, yes, that's another big thing for Gould. But killing the modern synthesis was not Gould's big idea. Gould was a promoter of this. He's a popularizer of this. In a lot of ways, Gould is playing the role here that Dawkins plays for all the other work on gene-centric evolution. Again, that's fine. They're both valid components of evolutionary theory. Okay, so a couple of things here. One I got to mention too is that Joe Felsenstein chimes in the comments, and he makes a really good comment that he says, my 2 cents, I call the current views on evolution the modern synthesis. That's basically whatever they are, that's the modern synthesis. You may want to call it something else, that's fine with me. This is just an argument about names, not about what processes are responsible for evolution. And keep in mind that a lot of the debates about this are affected by self-interest. So John Blotz, a fictional name, wants to be known as the guy who killed off the modern synthesis, and he secretly hopes that people will consider his new synthesis the Blotzian synthesis, which will probably only be around for about 2 years if the process continues. See also the extended evolutionary synthesis soon to be replaced by the hyper-extended evolutionary synthesis, and that the new improved evolution. Yeah. So right now you see a lot of people that are babbling, like James Shapiro, for instance, about their brand new synthesis, their new theory, which completely replaces the old one. And that's just stupid. No, that's not going to happen. Any synthesis, by the very name, is going to incorporate all the other good stuff, right? So it's not like we're discarding old ideas. We're incorporating new ideas and folding them into the big synthetic theory of evolution. So I have a lot of sympathy for what Felsenstein is saying here, that yeah, it's not as cut and dried as some people want it to be, where boom, you just cut it off here and now we get a new theory. That's also what creationists would love to see is, yeah, we threw out the old. No, we didn't throw anything out. We're just getting new stuff. We're expanding the theory. Okay, well, anyway, so I'm reading this stuff and I'm following a few links and trying to track down where some of the nonsense is coming from. And, not to say that Felsenstein's a really smart guy, really good stuff. And Jerry Coyne, even though he and I disagree on a number of things, he's a really smart guy. In his book on speciation, the one that he wrote with Orr, you have to read that if you're going to be an evolutionary biologist. It's really good stuff. But then I got into some of the wackier, loonier sides of things. So there are people who really, really, really hate Stephen J. Gould. I have noticed this multiple times in the past. And it's really weird how much hatred there is for Stephen J. Gould. And yeah, if you talk to most biologists, no, they don't feel that way at all. We got a question here. What percentage of breakdown would you say creationist actual scientists misquoting Gould? Well, it depends. That I would say that in general, if you talk to biologists, they're all saying, hey, Gould is great, get some great ideas. Dawkins is great. He's got some good ideas. Maynard Smith and a bunch of other people are far more influential. But yeah, they're not dissing any of these people. Where you start to see people freaking out about Stephen J. Gould is in the, that weird alt-right, right-wing race reality group. Again, this is not to say that the people who disagree with Gould are all racist. No, not true. There are good things to disagree with Gould about. But yeah, that there's this contingent of really nasty people who are convinced that Gould was evil personified. Oh, comment here. Yeah, I agree with this. So Lauren says, I liked SJG, but his prose style was terrible. He would never use a few words when something long, rambling, and repetitive would get the point across almost as well. Yeah, some, if you read his early essays, that's great. He's discursive. He goes charging off into a lot of related topics. But as he got older, it got worse and worse. And that's why I say The Structure of Evolutionary Theory is a terrible book to read. There are parenthetical comments within parenthetical comments. And it's just greatly bloated, and it's really terrible. Another comment here, they hate him because he gives creationist ammo to use against scientific consensus. I disagree there. No, Gould was an activist for evolutionary teaching. He was outspoken in his contempt for creationism. So no, that's not the issue. Yeah, the creationists might use him now because he's dead and they can twist his words and he doesn't argue back. No, the real reason that a lot of right wingers hate him is because of books like The Mismeasure of Man, where he goes through and he dismantles a lot of bad adaptationist, reductionist arguments that were used to favor racism. So yeah, that's one of the reasons he's a major target. Yeah, if you want to knock Stephen J. Gould down a peg, you are an instant hero to the far right, which is really a shame. Yeah, because no, Stephen J. Gould would not have favored that side either. Once again, he's dead, so it's really easy to take his words and distort them and twist them in rude ways. So yeah, that's one of the big problems here. Okay, so when I was browsing around looking for people who were arguing against Stephen J. Gould, I ran across an old article by Eliezer Yudkowsky, the guy behind Less Wrong. It's a weird article, and that's what I'm going to talk about for a little bit, because it's just it's an insane article. So let me switch to that, and I will also include a link to it down below. Yeah, okay. So this is an article by Yudkowsky that says, "Beware of Stephen J. Gould." Oh man, that guy, he's just terrible. Yeah, there we go. It's showing up. So anyway, Yudkowsky is a smart guy, but he's very much an autodidact. He's got no training in anything, basically. He's an opinionated mouthpiece with some smarts behind it and some selective reading. So what does Yudkowsky say here? This is from 2007, so it's an old article. And what amused me about it is his opening. He says, if you've read anything Stephen J. Gould has ever said about evolutionary biology, I have some bad news for you. In the field of evolutionary biology at large, Gould's reputation is mud. Not because he was wrong. Many honest scientists have made honest mistakes. What Gould did was much worse, involving deliberate misrepresentation of science. Oh, really? I would love to see his argument here. It's a terrible argument. But before I get into that, let me just deal with this business about uh, Gould's reputation being mud. Again, this was written in 2007. Okay. So if he is so terrible, you might expect that by now he'd be kind of ditched, he'd be abandoned. Nobody would be talking about him anymore. So I went to my textbook. This is my standard evolutionary biology textbook. And just to say a bit about it, it's a very general textbook. This is for undergraduates, so it doesn't get into a lot of the technical stuff. It tries to have a balanced, broad-based approach to everything. Oh man, I noticed it disappears. Okay, when I put where the green screen is. Okay, so maybe you can read it now. Evolutionary Analysis by Heron and Freeman. It's a good, solid book that isn't too weighty that I can use to teach to undergraduates, and it talks about the papers and it gives the evidence. It's a very worthwhile sort of text. And so we might ask, okay, well then obviously if Yudkowsky is right, we're not going to have anything in this about Gould. So let me switch back to this view. Let's see, I have to pin myself. There we go. There I am. Okay, now, oh man, stupid green screen. Anyway, there's the book. Okay, so you can just do this really simple exercise. Go to any, standard evolutionary biology textbook and ask, is Gould buried? Is he gone? Has he been discarded, tossed into the dustbin of history? No, he hasn't. So I thought I would just pull up this textbook and show you a few things here. So this is the section of the textbook specifically about punctuated equilibrium. The authors considered that worth talking about here in 2021, okay? Well, or 2020, whenever this book came out. So they're going to talk a bit about punctuated equilibrium. And as is typical for this book, it's not a radical book that's going to take an extreme. They have a very balanced perspective on Stephen J. Gould. So they mentioned that in 1972, Niles Eldredge and Stephen J. Gould broke from convention by claiming that stasis is a real pattern in the fossil record and that most morphological change occurs during speciation events. They call their proposal punctuated equilibrium. So now you got a definition of punctuated equilibrium. What they then ask is that true? Can we talk about stasis in the fossil record? And they illustrate a fairly common, oh, go away, green screen. I'm going to fix this later. Anyway, there's an illustration here that shows, that the typical branching pattern, if you talk to somebody who's well steeped in adaptationist ideas and believes totally in gradual evolution by and speciation by gradual processes, then they'll still illustrate it by saying, okay, in our cladograms, everything's at an angle, it's all branching off. And as soon as a species formed, it starts undergoing a kind of morphological deviation. It varies in response to the environment, which is fine. I suspect that happens many times. And if you talk to somebody who's really an extremist Gouldian, well, Eldredge and Gould, they would say, no, as soon as a species forms, it locks into its pattern, it stays in stasis for long periods of time until another speciation event occurs, and then you get variation again. So that those are the two extremes. And what this article wants to talk about is, no, that's not the case, that when we go digging, for example, he says here, Gene Hunt in 2007 analyzed more than 250 fossil sequences. He found support for directional evolution in 5% of the fossil sequences. The remaining 95% of sequence shows evidence of random walks in stasis in roughly equal proportions. So he's just saying stasis is fairly common. Uh, so it hasn't been discarded or disproven in any way. This is not mud. He also cites Irwin and Anstey's conclusion that paleontological evidence overwhelmingly supports a view that speciation is sometimes gradual and sometimes punctuated. And I would say that's kind of where the field of evolutionary biology is on punctuated equilibrium right now. It hasn't been abandoned. It's not gone, but it's not the sole explanation for all of the variation that we see in the world around us. So it's again a balanced, tempered perspective. That's what you're generally going to find. Now, this book also talks about some of Gould's other work. And for example, the issue that attracted me to Gould's work early on was that Gould was a major proponent of the role of development in evolution. Yeah. So phylogeny and ontogeny is the big book on that. And it's really good stuff. And I think that was a very positive contribution to evolutionary biology. Now, he wrote that book in 1977, way back when. And this was sort of a prelude to the 80s when suddenly everybody's talking about Evo Devo. So Gould didn't have that at his disposal. So he's kind of a prophet leading the way to the promised land, which is all evolution and development stuff. So it says here in this book, Stephen Gould drew on the discoveries of gene regulation, suggests that much evolutionary change would be attributed to alterations in the relative timing of developmental events, known as heterochrony. Another example of modest changes in gene regulation leading to dramatic morphological change. This is another thing creationists love to abuse. This is the fact that you can have mutations of large effect, tiny little changes that lead to dramatic, big effects in the organism. So there's a fair bit of that that's in the developmental literature. We know of examples of genes that do that. The question, of course, is, are those viable? Can you make that kind of mutation and that it then leads to a new species with different, we don't want to get into hopeful monsters, but it's not a hopeful monsters approach. It's just pointing out that there are these variations that can have dramatic effects on morphology. And among these are mutations that cause changes in timing and just subtle changes in timing. For example, the human brain. Why is the human brain so large? There's different perspectives you can take on this. One is to say, okay, we're going to take an adaptationist approach that large brains make humans more successful, that they make us more fit. There was an adaptive radiation where individuals who were smarter could do more things, could lead to the survival of their tribe and all that kind of stuff. And that's a legitimate level to look at it on. Another would be to say, okay, well, is it fair to talk about it being an adaptation? Could we also just talk about drift and random variation leading to variations in the size of the brain that later become useful? That's a legitimate approach too. Another question that a developmental biologist would ask is, what mechanisms lead to the increase in the size of the brain? That we know, for instance, there are timing genes active in the formation of the brain that lead to radical changes in growth of specific regions of the brain. So studying things like microcephaly, for instance, we know that there are genes that make small changes in these genes, and they lead to dramatic changes in brain size. Again, usually deleterious. It's called microcephaly because usually it goes down, and then you get people with small brains who have reduced function in the brain. So these are perfectly reasonable things to talk about. Yeah, so Gould is introducing these ideas. And this is one of the reasons Gould is well regarded, especially among developmental biologists, is because he wasn't a developmental biologist himself, but he pointed in the right direction. And he said, there's stuff we ought to be considering when we're talking about adaptation, and also when we're talking about drift and so forth, is that ultimately it's all going to be down to variation in genes, and in particular regulatory genes. And this is where he's starting to overlap with the gene-centric views, which is fine. They're all valid. I wish I could get this across to people. This also leads to another phenomenon where Stephen J. Gould kind of put him at odds with the adaptationists. So there's a mystery in evolution. This is from this textbook, A Mystery in Evolution, one that Stephen J. Gould called the 5% of a wing problem. How can evolution ever make a wing in Darwin's gradualist and adaptationist mode if 5% of a wing can't possibly provide any benefit for flight? This is a good one to bring up because I'm sure many of you are familiar with Dawkins' answer to that, which is, well, okay, 5% of a wing is better than 4% of a wing. So, we can get this. But that kind of glosses over the fact that there are transitions that are difficult, right? So you'd have to say, well, okay, but 4% of a wing has zero value for flight. It doesn't get you in the air. It doesn't help you glide. It doesn't help you hover. Nothing like that can happen with 4% of a wing. And so incrementally advancing it to 5%, you're still doomed. You still can't get off the ground. And so you can't get selection for these kinds of incremental advances in basic morphology. And Gould and Verba coined this term acceptation, where the way they were out to get around the problem is, no, it's your initial variation isn't to improve the proto wing for flight, it's for some other function. That we use acceptation to explain this. You don't use the gradualist, reductionist mode to explain. You say, okay, that these features evolved early on for some other function. And so, for instance, if you talk about dinosaurs becoming birds and evolving wings, that's not a problem for evolution because, well, maybe those early proto wings weren't for flight, they were for prey capture. So you got this expanded surface, a big net that you can use to capture insects. Or it's used in mating displays. Yeah, as Mr. Piece of Work mentions already, yeah, it's involved in sex. So you could have it evolving for that. And then only later does it become adapted for some other function. Okay, Mario mentions swimming. Yes, and there's things like flying squirrels. And there's lots of examples where you have some new feature that can be used for some function, but it's not necessarily the function we think of for that feature now. Mario mentioned swimming, sure. Insect flight, we're pretty sure that insect wings evolved from early gills, and so they were used for respiration. So this whole idea of acceptation is kind of crucial. Again, this textbook is noting these things because Gould did make creative contributions to evolutionary theory. Now, some of them may not pan out as thoroughly as Gould would like you to have thought they would, that punctuated equilibrium isn't the answer to everything. And that's fine too. But it's still a useful and interesting contribution to explain some of the features of the paleontological record. So yeah, let's just settle this right here that Gould was a smart guy who made good contributions, and I think he was an important thinker in evolutionary theory and at the end of the 20th century. So once again, he's not everything. Sometimes, this is a valid criticism of Gould, is that he sometimes went a little overboard in claiming the importance of his ideas. That he was good at self-promotion. Let's just grant that. And this also sometimes led to a little annoyance with Gould by some people. On top of the terrible, horrible right-wing loons, because he was also protested against things like racism. He and Lewontin were together in that boat. They're currently both the boogeymen to the racists, in part because they're dead and can't fight back anymore, which is really sad. Okay, I wanted to mention one other thing about this Yudkowsky article. It's a really bizarre article. So let me switch back to this. Where is it? Where is it? Somewhere, beware of student. There we are. Okay, so Yudkowsky is just really incensed at Gould for some reason. I don't understand why. He's got a kind of naive understanding of evolutionary biology, for one thing, which doesn't help. But anyway, one of the things he accuses Gould for, it's really, really bizarre, is he accuses Gould of plagiarizing George Williams' ideas. Okay, George Williams, yeah, he was very much a selectionist and adaptationist. He was another important figure in understanding the mathematics of genes. If anything, you could say he's even kind of the founder of the gene-centric idea. Again, I hate to do that because Williams was a smart guy, and he was working on this with a lot of other people. And let's avoid the great man of science idea. Anyway, so Yudkowsky's just going on and on about how Gould stole Williams' ideas. Incomprehensible. And in a lot of ways, Gould was an opponent of Williams' ideas. And once again, I have to qualify that because he could respect Williams' ideas and his really great contributions, but this idea that he was stealing adaptationism, this is again an example of how Yudkowsky is a dilettante who really doesn't know anything about this. So he rants and raves about how he stole these ideas. Yeah, so he says Gould's actual conduct was much strange. He wrote as if the entire Williams revolution had never occurred. Gould attacked as if they were still current views and romantic notions that no serious biologist had put forth since the 1960s. Then Gould presented his own counter-arguments to those no longer advocated views, and they were bizarre. Evolution is a random walk in complexity with a minimum at zero complexity and no upper bound, but there is an upper bound. Sheer chance explains why dogs are more complex than dinosaurs, but they probably aren't. Yeah, I see what I mean. Yudkowsky does not understand Gould in the slightest. Yeah, in Gould's book, what was it called? Oh, I forget because he had multiple names for this. The one where he's advocating this whole idea of random walks in evolution. And what Gould said is that in the absence of any selection pressure for greater complexity, you can get drift into the rightward side of away from the leftmost wall of minimum complexity. That was one of his key ideas, where just neutral variation could lead to an increase in complexity, but not necessarily. Okay. In some ways, this is a flawed idea, again, that on some scales, yeah, you can think this way. And it's just random chance. It moves you towards the right, away from the limitations of the leftward wall. But of course, as Yudkowsky notes, there is an upper bound. There are upper bounds in complexity. So the example I like to think of is that prokaryotes are energy limited. They can't process their metabolisms quite as fast because the central DNA nucleoid has to handle everything. It's controlling all of the complex and dangerous processes that are involved in extracting energy. And then there was the symbiosis theory. So we incorporated other cells, mitochondria, into eukaryotic cells to do this stuff. That gave a huge boost to the available energy and greatly increased the potential for greater complexity over time. So there was kind of an upper bound. And when we underwent symbiosis, the rightward bound moved way out there. That was a revolutionary event in the history of life on Earth. So I'd agree with that. But this bit, sheer chance explains why dogs are more complex than dinosaurs. This is not a Gouldian idea at all. Gould would have lifted an eyebrow and said, hey, wait a minute, but I don't think dogs are more complex than dinosaurs. This is kind of against the whole idea he had there. So yeah, it's kind of Looney Tunes reading this thing, these misrepresentations of Gould by Yudkowsky. Okay. Anyway, the entertaining part, though, where I got really, really amused is he keeps ranting and raving about it. Oh, I'm not calling a Gould a scoundrel because he was wrong. He deluded the public. No, he didn't. Then we get to this bit. Did Gould deliberately lie? If not, he executed one of the most epic feats of self-deception in the history of marketing. Marketing, that's the word that leads into this. The eminent John Tooby speaks. Oh, there's a link here to an article, a letter by John Tooby. And this was laugh out loud funny because, yeah, John Tooby, in case you don't know, is part of the pair Tooby and Cosmides. He's the founder of evolutionary psychology. And Tooby did not like Gould. Gould did not like evolutionary psychology. He saw it as pure pan-adaptationism and reductionism and all this horrible stuff. So to cite the eminent John Tooby, if anyone's going to be buried in the graveyard of history, it's going to be John Tooby and Cosmides, because evolutionary psychology is BS. Anyway, he cites this long article by Tooby and Cosmides, and here it is. Like I said, this to me is laugh out funny, because the entire point of Tooby's letter is to complain that Gould was wrong about accusing evolutionary psychology of being adaptationist. And he basically says, oh, we're not adaptationists because we considered all those things. We thought about all these alternate mechanisms like drift and so forth. And that's the whole point of this entire article is to complain and whine that that Gould falsely accused them of neglecting the importance of chance and drift in evolutionary biology. So like here he says, so what does the primary literature say about his bill of particulars on ultra-Darwinism? The few who bother to look at the chapter that Gould discusses on our reasoning experiments. Now, this is part of Gould criticizing Tooby's book. And here's the hilarious thing. Tooby is trying to argue that, okay, they should be astonished to discover we test not only adaptationist hypothesis, but about human reasoning, but 6 different byproduct hypotheses, as they are routinely in other adaptationist search in evolutionary psychology and biology. Okay, so he's saying, hey, Gould lied because he said we didn't consider all these neutral theories, these byproduct theories of so forth. That, you know, he's making a case that Tooby is writing adaptationist, pan-adaptationist stuff. The hilarious thing is that the book that Gould was criticizing is called The Adapted Mind. Yeah, the entire point of Tooby's book is that the way the brain works is the product of adaptation, natural selection and adaptation. So, you know, basically Gould was making an accurate point, but he's going to protest about this. Yeah. So he's complaining, how dare he say that we are not addressing all these other points. And the fact is that evolutionary psychology is very much an adaptationist discipline. It's exactly what Gould was complaining about. And Tooby's defense is to say, no, we're not as adaptationist as that, as he writes in his book called The Adapted Mind. It's just a self-own throughout. I'll mention also that, you know, Tooby is dearly beloved by the evolutionary psychology community. And I just want to quote a recommendation from a guy named Jeffrey Miller. Oh, Jeffrey Miller. Some of you may be familiar with him already. He's a terrible person, an evolutionary psychologist who has perennially argued that for these bizarre explanations, he's also a rather terrible person as a person. He's the guy who years ago wrote that we shouldn't accept any fat people to the graduate program at my university because they've demonstrated that they have no self-discipline and therefore they're going to fail. So you see what I mean, just really obnoxious. Anyway, Jeffrey Miller wrote a summary here. He says, evolutionary psychology's meta theory was also shaped very strongly by a series of ambitious, persuasive, and visionary articles by Cosmides and Tooby in the late 1980s and early 1990s that showed how adaptationism could be applied to the human mind. That was the whole point of Tooby and Cosmides' model, is adaptationism. The Cosmides-Tooby vision of evolutionary psychology profoundly influenced the thinking of other leading researchers. Yeah, poisoned the mind of a lot of people, such as Buss, Gigerenzer, Penker, and Thornhill. It was also adopted as the conceptual framework in the most influential popular accounts of evolutionary psychology. So yeah, it's a really bizarre argument. So he's complaining that evolutionary psychology is an adaptationist, yet his book is titled The Adapted Mind, and he's got all these people talking about evolutionary psychology, talking about how it is an adaptationist hypothesis. So yeah, this is the kind of nonsense we're dealing with. All right, so where do I want to leave this? I want to go. I've used up all my time basically, but let me just say, okay, to conclude, I agree with Larry Moran on this, but I also agree with Felsenstein that we're arguing terminology way too much. This is an echo of that whole thing about new atheism. You know, people in the atheist community are arguing about new atheism now. And we didn't even know how to define it. There was no clear, sharp boundary between new atheism, the old atheism, and whatever atheism is now. So it's a very silly thing to argue about. And arguing about the name is going to get you into all kinds of trouble because, as Felsenstein mentions, there's all these people who are right now clamoring to have the new adaptationist or new evolutionary theory, and they're all wrong. Also, to beat myself up a little bit, when evolutionary developmental biology was big, when it was first coming out, a lot of us were writing about the Evo-Devo revolution. And Sean Carroll himself in his book calls it the Evo-Devo revolution. And it wasn't. It was a new facet added to the reality of the evolutionary theory. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at here. And let me just stop with that. I will add some links to this, and I will right now turn it over to any questions. So Jason joined us. Did you have questions you wanted to ask?
Nope, just enjoying listening in. Thank you very
Good.
much.
Yes, and you're welcome to chip in with anything. Just let me know what you want to talk about. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this stream is for my Patreon followers and anyone else who wants to listen in. And I encourage people on my Patreon. Yeah, that's patreon.com/PZMyers. You can join too. It's cheap. $1 a month is all it takes to be a full member of that little group. Or you can donate more if you're really feeling generous. So yeah, please feel free to join in. I'm planning on doing this every 2 weeks or thereabouts, just having a conversation about something. Okay, yeah, we get some comments here about Tooby's letter. I do not believe in any gods, right? And yeah, what Tooby's article sounded like a lot to me was, oh, we're not racist. We think racism is bad from all the racists on the right. It's really easy to pay lip service and say, I don't accept X, Y, and Z, while endorsing a paradigm that fully enfolds and encompasses X, Y, and Z. And that's what they are busy doing. Okay, another comment. So we're surrounded between two gangs now, panspermia mafia and evolutionary psychologists. No, we're not surrounded by those. They're the extremes. They're the radical extremes that nobody is actually believing. I mean, that's one of the points I was trying to make early on. By just going to this typical, ordinary, unexceptional, well, it's nicely written, so it's exceptional in that sense. This relatively straightforward evolutionary biology text that we use in our classes, that are used in undergraduate and graduate programs everywhere. And they don't go for this. They don't go for this kind of extreme, radical, hey, evolutionary psychology versus the panspermia. I just had a thought. I didn't look. I should look and see, what do they say about evolutionary psychology? Evolutionary. Oh, this is kind of what I expected when I actually look at the index. No, evolutionary psychology isn't mentioned. So as far as evolutionary biology is concerned, I think evolutionary psychology is the mud that we have to deal with. I didn't bother to look up panspermia. No, that's not going to be in there. Yeah. Okay, do we have any other questions? I'm looking at the chat, seeing if anybody's got anything to say. Okay, maybe I have neatly filled up almost an hour. Now we can just wind this down right here. Let's see, I'll mention a few things that are coming up in the future. I've been doing a little bit of redesigning of my channel because I've also been doing that with the aid of the people at Free Thought Blogs, because you may be looking forward to this. Free Thought Blogs is setting up a YouTube channel. And we're going to try and get some regular content up on that isn't me and it isn't spiders. It's all various people on Free Thought Blogs. And we're planning to release that probably next week, because next week, next Saturday, is the 10th anniversary of the founding of Free Thought Blogs. Yeah, happy day. So we got to have a little bit of a party. So we're going to have something to celebrate that. And so we're going to have a live stream with various members of the Free Thought Blogs community who are going to be talking about, I don't know yet. I'm not going to run it. Okay. I'm just another lackey in the mob of the communal mob of Free Thought Blogs. So we're discussing ideas. We're going to discuss some more tomorrow about ideas of things we can talk about on our live stream next week. If you have suggestions, feel free to leave them to me. I'm not running the show, but I'm happy to pass along things to other people who are interested. And we'll try to get a good show going next week. I suspect that rather than talking about things like Gould and Dawkins and Darwin and all that kind of stuff, the Free Thought Blogs channel will be more about social justice and equality and liberty for all and good old socialism and all those happy things. An ebook. Okay, is there an ebook for my textbook? I don't know. I should look that up too for next time I teach the course. Yeah, I've been trying to be gentle to my students. So, for instance, for my cell biology course, I encourage them to go out and buy used books. That's another way to help save the environment, is get your books used if they don't have an ebook. It is a textbook, which means that there's all kinds of price gouging going on, and they'll come out with multiple editions. Another thing I tell my students is, these are undergraduates. You don't need the latest, greatest cutting edge of everything. So back editions are all good. So go for it. All right, we're coming up on just about exactly an hour. This looks like a good place for me to stop then. All right, so again, tune back in 2 weeks. We'll have another live stream, and keep an eye on my blog. That's freethoughtblogs.com/Pharyngula, which everyone knows how to spell. And I'll be making some announcements about our plans for Free Thought Blogs live stream probably next week to celebrate our 10th anniversary. Okay. Here we go. I will talk to y'all later. I'm ending the stream. Thanks for stopping by.